And you are live.
Okay, welcome back to House Education on February 5th, 2025. Going to take about an hour now to hear from the State Board of Education about the governor's proposal for transformation. I guess all of us with the understanding that not all the details are out there. But since we have limited time, I'm going to turn it right over to the chair and vice chair of the State Board. Welcome. Yes, I'll let the two of you figure out who goes first.
I went back to Jennifer.
Well, I was going to say, I feel like I'm sort of talking over Tammy's shoulders.
We are still working out our whole camera technique in here.
It's okay, I'll scoot this.
That'd be fine.
Feels a little-
That's fine.
My Midwestern sensibility.
Yeah.
Now coming back to you also, I'm sorry.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us back today. For the record, I'm Jennifer Deck Samuelson, Chair of the State Board of Ed, appearing remotely because I'm 2 hours away, but you were lucky to have Tammy Colby, our Vice Chair, with you in person. And I just wanted to provide a little background before we jump into this. So Tammy and I were invited last week to come speak with you guys about the board's response to the governor's proposal. And as you know, we are a board and we generally meet once a month. The board had not had the opportunity to discuss the education transformation proposal. So we scheduled a special meeting that we had this past Monday, February 3rd, where it really provided the board with an opportunity to come together and discuss the proposal. And basically that meeting was broken down into a question and answer session with Secretary Saunders. And then the board discussed responses to the proposal generally, and then specifically with regard to the idea of shifting rulemaking from the board to the agency. Tammy, I don't know if you want to add in anything there.
Sure. I think the only other thing I would say is as is the case with any open meeting in Vermont, we took public comment at the beginning for nearly 20 minutes. And I think that public comment certainly contributed to the board's discussion as well. So I believe all that public comment is up on the website now, or will be soon if Maureen hasn't done it, in terms of written comment, but you also can see that public comment on the video, which if it's not posted already, it will be posted soon. I think that's all.
Yeah. So just turning to the slide deck, and I apologize because we only submitted this a couple of hours ago. Things have been crazy on a few fronts in the education world. So we're doing our best to keep up to date with everything. But just to turn to that report or the slide deck, it's pretty short slide deck that you have. Fundamentally, I just want to start off by saying that the board does appreciate the initiative by the governor's office and the agency to put this proposal together. I'm sure that it took a lot of time, and it is always easier to react to something than it is to create it in the first instance. So I just want to acknowledge that, and I would echo the secretary's comments that it is bold. So I just want to call that out there. In general, the board supports the goals of the policy changes that are proposed. We support the idea of increased transparency and predictability in establishing the tax rate. We believe in the goals of fairness and equity and quality in delivering education to our students. We also support the specific outcomes that are proposed by the policy change, including expanding early childhood education, increasing after-school and summer programs in underserved communities, ensuring that every student benefits from essential arts. Oh, I just got a note that my slides are not being shown. I was told that I did not need to share my screen, but I can.
I can. Yeah, we have them here on our devices.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
anybody in the listening audience, they can go to our website and find them there.
Okay, thank you. Other outcomes that have been proposed include ensuring every student benefits from essential arts, providing additional access to mental health services for students, extending and enriching college and career pathways, and raising teacher salaries. These are all laudable goals that the board supports. And I just, again, want to put that out there. And then finally, we also support the better funding and support for career and technical education and for sending districts. And just anecdotally, this issue has come up. We were touring, I believe it was Twin Valley last spring, very small school, and they acknowledged that they have students who are going to early college and taking dual enrollment classes, and those take the students out of the school, and in ways that end up having unintended consequences on how a school sort of wraps up its high school years with its students. So the board has heard that from other schools. And I think it is important to acknowledge that the proposed funding for CTEs that would allow for increased funding to the Career Tech Center while also retaining some money for the sending district, the board also thought was really helpful. So there are many good things conceptually that the board likes about the education transformation proposal. That said, when we got down to the discussion of support for the proposal, the board really struggled with the lack of detail. And what we landed on was we had a robust conversation, and then I pulled out some of the questions as a for instance of things that the board would like to see before it could provide an opinion on the proposal. The state board, we agree that we need to change how we fund education in Vermont, but without more specific details, the board is unable to comment on either its support or lack of support for the foundation formula contained in the proposal at this time. So moving on to the next slide, these were some of the comments that came out in our conversation about the proposal generally, again, before we got to the specific issue of rulemaking. And so these are some of the things that I pulled out during the board's conversation. Board members and every board member there, I think, really contributed to the conversation that we had. So I'll just take a moment there to appreciate the fact that people were able to pivot and attend the special meeting on pretty short notice. Everyone felt it was important. So some of the comments that we received are that it's hard to comment about the proposal without seeing it in full and how everything fits together. We want more detail about assumptions underlying the foundation formula. We are wondering what other formulas were considered and why they were rejected. Wondering how revenue will be generated. We understand how the proposal promotes equity, but it wasn't clear to us how it promotes fairness and quality. We want to know how we can ensure that the proposal is implemented in a way that will not hurt students academically or emotionally. We also noticed that the proposal doesn't take into account the fact that schools can't scale down in a linear fashion. So for instance, I believe it's on page 13 of the proposal, there is a middle school staffing model that, basically if you have 50 students, you have X number of teachers and X number of specialists. If you have 100 students, then you have, I believe it was 6 teachers and 1.5 specialists. If you have 200, it's doubled. But what we recognized is that there's not I don't know if you call it a reverse economy of scale. At a certain point, you just need a certain number of teachers and specialists in order for a school to be able to function. So that was one of the things that board members noticed. Another question was, how will the proposal account for the fact that not all students that receive a particular weight actually have the same level of need? A big question, whose responsibility will it be to tell a school that it should or must close? Does that lie with the agency? Does it lie with the district? How will the decision be made? What's the framework there? Will there be intra-district choice? How would this work? And what are we giving up by, or what are we losing by giving up our current system? Because one of the board members acknowledged that just as it's important to talk about what needs to change, we want to ensure that there's a conversation about what is working well. What do we want to retain? And so those were many questions that were raised during the board's conversation that we wanted to bring to your attention. And I think it would be helpful to have answers to those. And I will pause there, and Tammy, you may have other comments to share.
I mean, I think what you see in our slides summarizes some key points, but we might roll it up a little bit into some big themes. And I think one of the undercurrents of that discussion, and I'm reflecting on that discussion as an individual, is that a general need for some coherence around a larger policy and leadership framework and how all these pieces fit. So it's not just that we need details here, you kind of need details going up too, which is how does this all fit into the bigger picture of where we're going and what the larger vision is for education, public and sports alike in Vermont. And I think you saw a lot of friction around that in the comments going on in the meeting. But I think a couple things, the board, I think, has restated that we are the public and public education, that we provide an important outlet for the public to engage through rulemaking in other ways, and that is not that ability to sort of have that outlet for having public engagement is different when it's an agency versus the State Board of Education. We're independent, though we are appointed by the governor. I think we've demonstrated over and over again our independence in many ways, right, from that. And then I think we'll get on to some very specifics about the proposal with respect to rulemaking, and I'll hold my comments on. But I think those are just two sort of more general sentiments that percolated in the conversation around the overall proposal, and that is we need more details down, but we also need more details up, right? Like, how does this fit? What's the larger vision? Where are we going in terms of a more coherent policy framework? And that the board really feels that we are the public and public education.
So moving on to the board's conversation specifically about the issue of shifting the role of rulemaking from the board to the agency. There was general consensus that the board feels that it should retain rulemaking authority for some categories of rules. And we can have a further conversation about that. There was sort of the corollary acknowledgement that not all rules need to be rules and not all rules benefit from being under state board authority. So as we think about the rule series generally that is currently under the State Board of Education's authority, I think the board feels some of those rules could be and should be handed to the agency just because of the way we're set up versus the way the agency is set up, and acknowledging that we don't have oversight over the agency the way we did prior to 2012. And also there are probably things that are currently in rule that don't need to be rules. They could be regulations that aren't subject to the formal rulemaking process. Again, just an acknowledgement that the State Board of Education does not currently have adequate resources to engage in rulemaking. So that is really a decision point for the General Assembly. If we retain any element of rulemaking, we will need the resources to allow us to do that. To the extent that rulemaking is shifted to the agency, we would want assurance that rulemaking under the Agency of Education's authority would be inclusive and responsive to the public. And this goes beyond, I mean, any agency that engages in rulemaking has to comply with APA requirements. But this kind of goes beyond that. So to Tammy's earlier point, all State Board of Education meetings are open to the public. Our meetings of the full board are recorded. We always take public comment, to the extent that the board is in charge of rulemaking, that happens, in front of the public. They really get to see how the sausage is made. And I think the concern is that if you take away the rulemaking authority from the board and hand it to the agency, there may not be that same level of transparency because there's not that same requirement. Board members also raised concerns about agency capacity to engage in rulemaking. And we also thought it was important to note that we are independent, we are neutral, we act within the constraints of legislative intent. We are not a political body. So there is a concern that the proposed shift in rulemaking from the State Board of Ed to the Agency of Ed will result in less independence and more politicization of education through the rulemaking process. There was a concern that was raised about whether increased efficiency will come at the expense of decreased equity. And finally, there was a concern that, just thinking down the road, if we set up the system of shifting rulemaking to the agency, maybe that makes sense now, but if and I'm not saying it does, but if it, you know, assuming arguendo that it does, if we give that authority to the agency, what happens with a new governor and a new secretary? And the concern that this may actually destabilize our educational system, because again, it's being subjected to the political process. I will pause there. Tammy, if you want to jump in.
I'll try to synthesize a little bit, right? I think some of the things that we observed in the proposal were language like practical, right? That moving the rules was a practical matter. I think what you heard us say is, like, I think we need to see a balance between sort of this efficiency mindset and this equity mindset, and the ability for individuals to have access to that process. Public education is not like establishing regulations that govern measurement at a gas pump, right? We're talking about our kids. We are a state that values public education and our independent schools as well, right? And having that be a closed process feels very antithetical to sort of how our values are set up. And if it is a practical matter, and we feel like we need to think about efficiency, improving efficiencies in the rules, that seems like that should be a collaborative process with the agency. And for example, on the CTE rules that we are, intending to open up, but we're waiting for some of these other things to happen now, right? The proposal is that the agency takes the first pass and gives them to us, and then we go through the rulemaking process. I think there are ways that we can partner and make this a very efficient process that also keeps those lanes of communication open for the long run, while we still maintain that balance, right, between, at least under the current governance structure, where we have an agency that is part of the executive and we have a largely independent board.
All right. Thank you. The first part of the presentation of the slide deck is an excellent summary of every sort of group of people who have looked at this and come up with for concerns and questions, including this committee, and the commission, future public education. So actually kind of nice to have it written down, and seeing that everybody is kind of on the same page as to what the big questions are and what we need to know more about. Committee, do you have questions? Representative Brady.
One of the bullets here I think is really helpful, the acknowledgement that not all rules need to be rules, and not all rules benefit from being under state board authority. I don't know if you're prepared to do it today, but any kind of direction from your perspective of what rules best fit in a state board. And it certainly, I think we echo the concern about resources and are starting to feel the consequences of a potentially under-resourced state board as we now look at much more robust work. So we were talking about school construction earlier today, I know we talked about that briefly during the working group, but when we look at sort of the whole menu of things that have to happen in education, which pieces really are most important to be under kind of a state board role that has a public facing aspect?
I think we have to think in terms of.
Clarify, we were talking this morning about giving you even more rulemaking in school construction.
All right,
It was always there.
get my hard hat on, but I mean, let's just zoom out, right? Like, so what is good policy? Good policy is a coherent framework, right? And we need a coherent policy framework, and we need a coherent regulatory framework, right? And we have things in rule right now. And we talked to you about this when we came to talk to you about sort of what the state board does. We've been looking, a lot of our rules are out of date. Most of them are out of date, right? They're out of date. They reflect things, but also it raises question about if they're so out of date, should they even be in regulation in the first place? So I think let's zoom out. I think there needs to be a conversation about what our regulatory framework should be and how does that align with our policy goals. And likely everything that's in rule and regulation right now doesn't need to be in it. Do we need to have regulation that says the State Board of Education use Robert's Rules of Order? I don't think so, right? And some of the things that are rules and regulations can't cuff the agency from being nimble in ways that they need to be nimble, right? They need to come to us to ask us for waivers for extending or shortening school years, right? And things along those lines. I'm not sure that makes sense, right? So when we have a conversation about who gets what, I think we got to zoom up a level and say, what is our regulatory framework here? And how does that align with our policy? I think our stance is that first, The EQS, the independent school rules, the CTE rules, and the special education rules should all be in one place. And I would actually argue that the district quality standards should as well. Those 5 things work together. And if they are in 2 places, you got 2 entities doing 2 things, we run the risk of having incoherence, which is going to make it really difficult for schools and districts to do their jobs. It also means we could have one element of education in our state having very different requirements than another one, right? Like those things need to be trued up, and we need to be consistent in order to, right, to stay true to our constitutional obligation of providing substantial equal education opportunities, right? So I wouldn't pull those off. And I think in our perspective is the rules should stay with the State Board of Education. It would be at least those 5 rules. I think we have to have a larger conversation about all the other rules and where they fit in the regulatory framework more generally, and whether or not things belong in regulation or not. And some of the things that fall in those other rules may not belong in regulation, and they can simply be turned over to the agency as part of their standard operating procedures, which will fall under other kinds of jurisdictions.
And just to add on to that, I mean, another way to think about this is, I feel like the State Board of Ed has more of the 20 to 30,000 foot view, or maybe the 10 to 30,000 foot view, where we're really sort of more of an umbrella, where we are responsible, or responsible for sort of this larger, higher up view, as opposed to, right now there are rules under our authority that really deal with the day-to-day details of a school. State Board of Ed has no oversight over public schools. I mean, that all falls on the agency. So that's an example of, a category of rules that the State Board really ought not to have, because to the extent that something comes up under those rules, it basically means that we have to ask the agency what's going on so that we can figure out what to do. So I think, that lack of efficiency tells me that that is something that really ought to be more under the agency's purview. But I think to Tammy's point, to have, this consistency between, are we talking about CTEs? Are we talking about independent schools? Are we talking about public schools? To have that cohesion of the whole system, I think that makes sense to me.
Representative Long has a question.
So I really appreciate this conversation. And I guess one of the things that I really also appreciated hearing was the collaboration that it seems to me must happen, and seems like it does happen, between the agency and the State Board during rulemaking process. I mean, that's obviously really critical. So reviewing what rules we have and where they belong, it is really important. Under the second bullet again, I believe one of you, I can't remember which one of you mentioned it, that things had shifted from a agency, from a Department of Education to an agency of education back in 2012, and that was part of the reason why the State Board has a different role. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that impacts the work down the road on this.
Sure. So in this was originally one of the topics that we were invited to speak about today. So I think between Tammy and I, we have spoken with a number of people who were either former commissioners or were intimately familiar with the way things operated when the board oversaw what was then the Department of Education. And I will say, I mean, I've been on the board now since 2020. I've been the chair since fall of 2022. I have been trying to figure out this knot of how to untangle State Board of Ed from Agency of Ed, and come up with some sort of elegant solution. And I'm not kidding when I say this has kept me up at night. What I have learned, and what many of you may know, because I was not really on the scene back, prior to 2012, is that when the board oversaw what was then the department, certainly the board had a lot more authority. The department had a lot less authority, but it was also a much more collegial sounding relationship, not only between the board and the department, but between the board and the public. And this goes back to when public schools were approved. So, you know, what I've heard is that the board went around and visited, you know, tried to visit every public school in the state. And there was much more of a connection between the work of the board and the people who were affected. More people, you know, from what I hear, more people came to board meetings. It was a much more robust conversation. People would bring issues that they were experiencing or sharing good ideas that they had discovered. And the board would have sort of these high-level conversations about, you know, what can we do about this? You know, how can we fix a problem that's been identified? How can we promote a solution that has been identified? And what I find now is with this shift and, you know, not the full divvying up of assets that has, you know, taken 13 years to get to this point, there are a lot of, you know, broken loops, broken feedback loops. And so a lot of times when we have members of the public show up at a board meeting, they come because they don't know where else to go, but they will raise issues that the board literally has no authority over. And so it's really frustrating because we hear things and we have nothing to do with it. And I, you know, occasionally get emails from people who don't know where to turn. They find my email address online. They reach out to me. They say, this is the problem I'm having with my school or my supervisory union or my child's teacher or, you know, whatever the issue is, they don't know where to turn. And then, you know, I sort of do a little bit of research for them and, you know, point them in the right direction. But I think to me, this feels like a loss. And I think what I'm seeing personally with the board is a little bit of frustration because you've got people who are deeply invested in education in the state. They want to do the work. They want to be helpful. They want to be engaged. And it's really not clear what our role is. And so I think that creates a lot of frustration where, you know, you come to meetings and I've had people ask me, why did this person present at our meetings? Why are they here? To what end does this help what the board is supposed to be doing? And I think, you know, when I look at how things were set up prior to 2012 versus where they are now, and let me be clear, I've heard that Act 98 solved a lot of problems, but it also created new problems. And I am not here to say that one way was better than the other. What I am saying is I'm noticing what the board has lost through this change and lack of clarity. And I don't think that's just the board. I think it probably spills out to the entire education system.
It definitely spills out. We had Armando Villaseca, the last commissioner of education, testify before us. And the exactly what you brought up about the board and its role and the public turning to the board, I think for all the things you just talked about, they've actually, you know, the public is looking for people to solve their problems. They're now turning to us for individual things. And we are stuck in the same situation. We can't necessarily solve a problem, but it does seem under the old regime that that connection between the board and the agency and the public was direct and effective. So there is a certain longing for the old days among many of us as a result.
I think that's actually a really great observation, Representative Conlon, too, because as a policy scholar, somebody who looks from the outside, what I see oftentimes is legislature trying to get traction on this, this bill and that bill and this and this and this, and pushing from the outside into the agency. And that creates all kinds of tensions within the agency too, and it creates tensions within the field, right? And so we can end up with real fragmented policy that way too. And I think that's just another observation to put on the table. I think it's not just the state board who's trying to navigate. I think the legislature's also been trying to navigate this. And we see policy, we see things that are ending up in statute that in many states would never end up in statute. Right? Because that's the way you're taking public input and you're being responsive to your constituencies, trying to do something. But now what we're doing is we're creating layers and layers of statute, right? Yeah. And it's so hard to implement statute. It's like that's a hard thing to do. So I just would add that I think that's a great observation, and I would just sort of highlight. I think the kind of tensions that you're seeing between the state board and the agency are also some similar tensions between the legislature and the agency under the current arrangement, right? And so I think there's one other thing that has not been mentioned, and it's come up a couple times recently, is like, is there a conflict of interest between the implementing body and the rulemaking? Where they have rules and implementation in the same spot. Now, I know many agencies have rulemaking and implementation in the same spot. But we also have a system here of checks and balances, right? And we have bumped into a couple of cases recently where there have been real questions about whether or not the rules have been interpreted the way the state board intended and whether or not they're being implemented. I don't think anything nefarious is going on there, right? Like it's just, but that's a challenge, right? And there's no real good way of solving, right, that kind of disconnect. But what that does is it creates implementation challenges, right, in the field. And, there isn't a good way to resolve when you have this interpretation challenge that's going on, right? And you have one party saying this and another party, state board thinks this, the agency thinks this. Well, how do we figure that out now, right? So I just want to say, like, that's another sort of gap, right? So we've got like these cracks in the system. And I think to Chair Samuelson's point, these problems of feedback loops and what that's doing is it's making the job of people in the field really challenging. I think we hear that in lots of different ways.
I'd say, given that we are embarking on at least some sort of added responsibility to the state board, even if it's just working out the CTE rules, but there could be more. I do hope the next time we see you both that you might come to us with a specific proposal. It seems to me that if you're taking on CTE rulemaking, that it would not be out of bounds to ask for the resources needed to make that job possible with all your other responsibilities.
We are going to come back to you with a budget request of UN Senate.
I mean, I think the governor has been very supportive of CTE education, and I think he would probably support additional resources for the board to do that rulemaking. Representative Brady. It's
an important set of rules, and we need to make sure that they're trued up with the EQS and our independent school rules, special education rules too. Like all of those things need to be part of a cohesive canon.
Obviously, one of the, came up in our testimony last Friday, one of the proposals or sort of solutions out there is to say, well, we should undo sort of 2012 and go back to department and go back to state board being above, being over the department. If you set aside that change and assume we're going to continue to operate roughly in the construct we are now, where we have an agency of education that's within the administration and a state board of education, do you see a path forward of untangling that knot, as you said, Chair Samuelson? And if I remember vaguely, Tammy, you and Dan French at one point, former Secretary of Education, and I think it was pre-COVID, or no, it was not, but I don't know. It maybe started pre-COVID, and we're trying to really work out sort of this clarity of who does what rules should sit where, and what. And do you think that is there a path forward with the agency to have some consensus around how to separate out and clear who's in what lane and where things need to fall? I will say this is now my third term, and it is very unclear to me. So I can't imagine, in the field and those in both of those bodies.
I'll go back to, I think we need a coherent regulatory framework. Right? And we need to think about what are operational rules. First of all, what needs to be in regulation versus what does not regulation. And I think that's part of updating the rules, right? It's just having a good conversation about, does this need to be there, right? Or is this operational flexibility that we should give the agency? Right? Then I think after you have that conversation, we need to think about, well, which of those are operational rules? That really makes sense to Jennifer's point, right? To think about the agency having the flexibility to quickly, update or change those. But then you have these larger rules, and I'll go back to the big five, right? I would say those rules are not operational. They're sort of the 10 to 30,000 foot rules. And those are the rules where public input, I think, is very important. That it's very important that those rules are not politicized, right? And that we have them all in one place so that we can maintain consistency across those rules. So I think that's one thing we can do, and I think we've already sort of set out, you know, we've been, in our last testimony, we talked about, like, we're starting to think about a plan for updating the rules, and part of that rule update would be to have that conversation about what should stay, what should go out of the canon in general, and which are kinds of operational things that probably make sense for the agency to have more responsibility over. But at the same time, I think our vision would be that those rules would stay.
So process wise, does it mean it's something that the state board could sort of come up with the proposal or the plan in some discussion with the agency, or does it require legislative action to say, you do this, you do this?
I don't think it requires legislative action.
Well,
Talked about.
I mean, it would to shift certain rule series from the state board to the agency. That
Plus they were
statute.
sunsetted.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask a follow-up question? So when I appreciate the clarity around like 4 or 5, these major categories of rules. Those feel to me like things that are really important in sort of on the ground, day-to-day operation and like the experience of kids in schools, you know, what the education quality standards are, what the special education rules are. And the refrain we hear again and again and again from the field is this lack of support from the agency or centralized leadership to implement things. So if we were to stay in the same kind of framework we are now, is there a way that you have the rulemaking part of it, but yet there is still a role for the sort of robust implementation part of those pieces from the agency? Or is there
The agency will always have to. Right,
Yeah.
like the state
They
board
always
is
have.
never going to be in a position of implementing rules. I think the question, I think what I'm reflecting back into you as a question is if that's sort of the outcome we go to, right? Like some sort of bifurcation that we have right now where some rules stay here, some rules go away, but then go over here, we still have this implementation question on the table, right? And I think there are 2 pieces of that implementation question, at least 2 pieces we have to address: capacity and oversight, right? And I think those 2 questions have to be addressed in this larger conversation. And I don't know that the state board has any, under the current configuration, would have nothing to do with capacity or oversight, because under the current configuration, we don't have oversight and we have nothing to say about capacity or the agency. So I think those 2 things would be incumbent on the legislature to have, the General Assembly to have to sort out. But I think those are the 2 other things that sort of are in this stew, right?
Last week, we had a policy proposal from the Vermont Superintendent's Association that sort of talked about some of the bigger goals of, you know, that are, I'd say, smaller bites than the governor's proposal is taking. But essentially the idea is to work within the framework that we have of DQS and EQS in terms of class size minimums, or some of the other topics that came up.
school size, like
Districts.
model school sizes, and district sizes?
And it was, you know, it was an intriguing set of policy ideas because it doesn't dismantle the system and rebuild it. It sort of says, we've got a system in place. And I don't know where I was going with that question. It was all very well formed in my head. But, you know, I guess with the way the system is now, and it is sort of bifurcated, and oversight and implementation is really us and the agency, not you, but EQS is with you. You know, I guess what would be needed would be the bigger question. If we were to go down a path that said we're going to work within the framework that we have of EQS and DQS, what would be needed from the state board or in general to make that workable? It's kind of a big, vague question. I apologize.
Is it the same resource questions?
I guess it just falls under the same sort of resource
Well,
question, or.
let me say, it
who
was
does
not a topic that we discussed on Monday as a
Right.
full board. So
Yeah.
Any,
I'm sure I know whole
any
different
kind of
stuff.
response I think Jennifer and I might provide would be us as individuals, not as
Yes.
representing the state board.
Mm.
I think I just want to
Yeah.
clarify. I think
Totally
that's an
understand.
important part, clarification. So we can give our sort of our perspectives on that. Could one imagine a world in which we built off our current system to move to a higher, to a better state? Yes, there probably, I think the superintendent's proposal is the proposal to give a closer look to, right? And could you overlay some of the other recommendations that have come out of the governor's office, such as a foundation formula on that? Yes, you could. But that's not, you've heard me say before, money's the means, not the ends, right? And so simply overlaying that on top of an existing structure probably isn't going to achieve other kinds of goals around cost containment, improvement, equity, and opportunities. And so then to your question, Representative Conlon, it's like, so what additional supports do we need in that system, right? So where are going to be the pinch points in that? The pinch points in that are going to be, how are we going to help districts and schools consolidate, right? And what's that going to look like? And then what would the role of the state board be in that? I'm sort of having an Act 46 flashback. I see it on your face too. Right, but I think that's one of the questions, like what's that going to look like? Where does construction funding come into that conversation, right? And we can make this an opportunity to build new high schools, for example, that we consolidate to, right? Where we improve options. I think those are the kind of things we have to sort out if we're going to start with that kind of proposal going forward. Some of those details may be in the proposals that we have yet to see coming from the governor's office, because we don't have a lot of detail. But I think it's all fair game.
And just to that, I would add the general observation that the state board is neutral and we are independent. And I think that can be something that could really be leveraged in a way that would be helpful. I mean, we've got some thorny issues that need to be resolved. And when I think about the State Board of Ed's role in Act 46, I think that was a really good example of how the state board can work for the benefit of furthering education in Vermont. I think that was really, really hard work. That predated my time on the board. But I know that was a lot of work that the board put in to, hearing from various school districts and putting together that report and making some really, really hard decisions. But again, those decisions were made by an independent, neutral body. And I'm sure, as we think to the future, and if there are changes that are going to need to be made that might be difficult, I think the state board would be a natural place where the General Assembly could look to delegate those difficult decisions to us, and of course give us the support that we need to be able to do the work. But I think that is one of our benefits.
I thought you were going to say the work that the legislature foisted upon the state board for Act 46 was enormous and overwhelming, and don't do it again.
Well, I can't say that because I wasn't there. So,
Well, to Chair Samuelson's point, right? So how's that not going to get solved, right? Like, and I've said before, like closing a school is like closing a post office. This is really hard, right? It gets tired of communities. We were kind of talking about that before. It's like, and so but we also need to not do this community by community by community. We kind of have a big picture, right? We need people to get behind the big picture. What's the vision? Where are we going to that is positive, right? And I think the state board already in its charge is responsible for developing a vision, right? We can develop a vision and sort of a picture of where we're driving to. We can take public input. We can help balance some of these challenges, right? And we can work hand in glove with the legislature and with the agency and sort of navigating all that. But when it's all said and done, we are independent, right? So it does, I think it's one way to try to depoliticize something which is going to be deeply political, not just political with a capital P in terms of politics, but political in terms of how we interact with each other, our communities. And that's going to be really important if that's going to be the process, right? If it's not going to be just mandated down, right? Going to go to some number of smushed mega districts, but we're going to build from the ground up, then there's going to need to be an independent arbiter in that process somewhere, right? That people have confidence in, that are going to be fair, right? It's one thing to lose. It's another thing to lose when you think it's unfair. Right?
And I think that also goes to the importance of having a framework.
Okay.
As we are thinking about, if we are reducing the number of districts, and what does that look like? And are we talking about schools closing? And what does that look like? What would be the trigger points there? I think it would be really, really important to have a clear set of guidelines and a framework to allow anyone to make that decision. And so, for instance, the board engaged in a similar exercise where we sunsetted Rule 7320, which had a list of accrediting organizations that had been recognized by the State Board of Ed. And that was another example of a rule that was woefully out of date. Some of those organizations didn't exist anymore. And the board had a conversation about, what should we do with the rule? And what we decided was that what mattered less to us were the specific names of organizations, and what mattered more were the indicia that the board was looking for in order to be able to recognize an accrediting agency. And so that was one of the changes that we put into 2200, where we now have a very transparent, comprehensive framework in place of any accrediting agency that wants to be recognized by the board has to meet, the following extensive criteria. And then the board has a conversation and we decide whether or not to recognize an accrediting agency. So I bring that up as an example where the board, it was a very, very thoughtful process about, creating this framework where now, and we have not approved or we have not recognized all accrediting agencies that have applied. Some we have, some we haven't, and we're still working through the list. But we have a framework that we can go back and rely upon to say, this is the reason for the decision that we've made.
So, I'm gonna make a statement and ask a question. So, I have been strongly in favor of depoliticizing public education. And I say that because, I believe public education is a common good, and everyone should have equal access to it, equitable access to it. So I say it within that framework. I asked this question with that framework. We did get testimony last week that it brought back so many memories because I've been through this process with the change. I wasn't a legislator when we made the change, but for full disclosure, I did testify to the legislature on that change that happened in 2012. And so when Commissioner and then Secretary Armando Villaseca came in to testify to us, it brought back so many memories for me of the shift. But one of the main concerns that I believe, and maybe this committee took it differently, but I believe came out from him was the politicization of the whole system, frankly. And so the question I have is there a way to continue to operate with a secretary and an agency of education while still empowering the state board to be that neutral, critical, in my mind, oversight of the system? Is there a way to marry those two, or would we need to actually go back to a Department of Education commissioner to be able to separate ourselves? And I'm going to say this because I say this about every one of our decisions we make in this room about education. I do not want us to be dictating as a legislature curriculum in the classroom. I mean, I'll say that, and I'll continue to say I've been fighting against that for years because we all have our roles. And I believe the state board plays a critical role. And I think we've harmed education in the state of Vermont by changing over time that role. So love to hear your thoughts on it.
The rules aren't political, right? I
That's
would
right.
say that the EQS, independent school rules, and hopefully, do the CTU rules, we have been very careful as a state board not to politicize those rules and to stay within statute. Now, have we taken, and we've been attacked for that in some ways, right? Because there have been interests in having us do this or do this in the rules, and we have been very, very careful to try to stay within statute. We've sought counsel, and we have really tried to buffer the rules from political whims and preferences. And there have been times, and I can speak personally, where it's actually sometimes staying within statute construction is not even what I think, like, but that's not our job. Our job is not to politicize the rules. We have to stay within statute. And so I think that's one really important thing about keeping the rules with the state board, is that the rules, we don't open up the can of worms to politicize the rules. We are responsible for making sure that the rules stay within statutory construction. And that, I mean, I think that's point number one, right? We can't let the rules get politicized. Implementation of the rules, that's a different question. And then the second part of your question is like, well, how do we oversee that? Well, we don't have any statutory authority to oversee that. All we do is we raise questions. And we have been increasingly raising questions, right? If you've watched the state board meetings over the last 6 or 8 months, the questions have come in more frequently, right? For serious questions, more intensity in those questioning, right? But we don't have any rule. All we can do is raise questions, right? And pretty much our purview for raising questions is with respect to the rules, right? We write the rules and we can ask questions about their implementation. So that's the piece that is hard, right? What we can do and what we have been doing to the best of our abilities, keeping those rules from being politicized.
And I would say to your question about do we need to revert to the system of the board overseeing the department? I would like to think that it would be possible to create a structure where we still have an agency and we still have a board. But, as Tammy said earlier, that needs to be a thoughtful process that is holistic, to ensure that we've got alignment of, policy and governance, and that there are clear lanes, for the agency and clear lanes for the board. I do think that's possible, but that is a pretty heavy thought exercise that hasn't happened yet. I think it needs to happen, and I would love to invite the board's participation in that exercise.
Can you share with me the process of board members being appointed to the state board prior to 2012 and the process today?
I'm not sure I know that. I mean, I think they've always been appointed by the governor.
They have, but I
mean, and that is still the way it is today.
the screening process, the application process was the.
I don't know.
Do you give us a walkthrough of how it functions today? Up to the, governor picks them, but does anybody apply? How does it happen?
I don't know, because I'm not in the governor's office.
Okay, so but you play no role
We
in,
play no role.
okay.
But my question is, did the state board play a role in that in the past? And it was, I've been trying to remember, and I asked Armando the same thing.
I
Armando
don't know.
Did not.
was unsure, but he didn't think it was any different than it is today. That's what he said.
Not sure that's what he said, but.
All right, okay, you gave us a lot to think about, and we appreciate you. So we asked you to come in, and you then held a board meeting so you could come in with the board's position, and that's very much appreciated. And thanks for the quick turnaround.
Well, thank you. And let me just say that our next board meeting, I mean, we can always have special meetings, but it's always easier if we know in advance, just so that we can be as helpful as possible. But our next monthly board meeting is February 19th. So maybe if there are specific things that, as you're having conversations, that you would like the board to discuss, and want to let us know, I think we will finalize the agenda by February 14th, that Friday before the meeting. let us know. We can put that on the agenda, and then Tammy and I can come back and report back to you again.
Okay, well, we might have a little bit of a committee discussion on that.
Yeah.
With some ideas, but obviously there's probably plenty on your table already.
Sure, but I mean, this is super important, right? So if there are specific questions, it actually helps us frame the discussion. If we have specific questions.
This
Thank
has been
you.
really helpful.
Thank you very